So I'm really excited this morning to get the show started, to let you stop hearing from me and go into our wonderful lineup of speakers. And this morning, we're really excited to have Dr. Julia Brody with us. She is going to talk to us about breast cancer and the environment. This is not a topic that we've covered before at our forum, so we're really happy to be bringing you new information. Again, if all of these videos will be available on our website shortly after the forum, but I'm going to stop here, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Julia Brody. I'm going to stop sharing. All right. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I do have some slides to share, so I'm going to take a moment to do that. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here and add this topic to your conversation. And I'm betting that a lot of you got up this morning to join this conversation because you know something that most Americans don't know, consistent with what Dr. King has been telling you. You may be surprised that 2/3 of Americans think that cancer is mostly due to inherited genes. But we're here because that's not true. Breast cancer is influenced by many different factors across the life cycle, some of which you just heard about. And as you have already heard, some of them we can change. So in the US today, about 5 or 10% of breast cancers are due to the high-risk BRCA genes, and a study of twins in Northern Europe showed that altogether about 1/3 or a little bit less than 1/3 of breast cancer risk is due to inherited genes, including ones we don't know very much about yet. So that means the more we learn about what's going on in that big blue chunk of the circle that isn't inherited genes, the more we can reduce breast cancer risk. And Silent Spring Institute was founded about 25 years ago, specifically to look into that. We were founded by leaders of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition to specifically to be a scientific team that would focus on environmental chemicals and breast cancer. In addition to knowing that many breast cancers are not associated with high-risk inherited genes, we also know that genes and environment are interacting, and that even with women who have the high-risk genes, environmental factors are affecting how old they are when they first get diagnosed. So I'm really excited to be here today to tell you some key examples of what we know now about the science, some strategies you can use to reduce harmful exposures, and some tips on how to spot misleading information and talk with skeptics. So starting with what we know now. We know that breast cancer is influenced at many stages across the life cycle. The breast is more vulnerable to carcinogens during the times when it's developing. These are called windows of susceptibility. It includes before birth, during puberty, during a first pregnancy, and at menopause. And some of those risk factors that Dr. King just told you about fit into this picture, like how old you were when you got your first period, how old you were at a first pregnancy and at menopause. Another thing that we know is that there are many different biological pathways to breast cancer. Silent Spring Institute is particularly focused on 3 of these: chemicals that can alter breast development. So these are affecting those windows of susceptibility, changing how the breast grows in ways that make it more susceptible to carcinogens. Chemicals that affect hormones. They could mimic hormones, or they could stimulate more production of hormones. We're particularly interested in chemicals that affect estrogen or progesterone, which we know are breast cancer risk factors. And the third group of chemicals are classic carcinogens. These are chemicals that damage DNA and can start a tumor. So there are well-established examples of each of these pathways. DES, the pharmaceutical, is an example of an exposure that influences breast development. We know that because, unfortunately, women who took this drug during pregnancy, they took this drug in hopes that it would prevent miscarriage. It didn't do that, unfortunately. And we learned later that it increased breast cancer risk in both the moms and the daughters. An example of an exposure that increases hormone activity is combination estrogen and progesterone hormone replacement therapy, which you also already saw in Dr. King's slides as a breast cancer risk factor. An example of a carcinogen that damages DNA is ionizing radiation, especially when the exposure is early in life. And that is one of the ways that B-PrEP is serving women who, for reasons that may have been necessary at the time, were exposed to ionizing radiation as girls. So we have laboratory tests for all of these biological pathways, but you may be surprised to know that in the US, you don't have to test chemicals for safety before you put them into products. And because of that, these exposures are very common in all kinds of consumer products, things that you might have bought at the store, from cleaners and fragrances to plastics. And some of these names are now familiar because of market campaigns: bisphenols like BPA, phthalates, which are anti-androgens, oxybenzone and benzophenone 3, which are UV filters, parabens, which are used as preservatives in some personal care products, and PFAS. This one has been in the news a lot lately. These are non-stick and stain-resistant coatings, and they've become common drinking water pollutants in many communities around the US. We're very fortunate in the MWRA water supply that we don't have these chemicals, but they can also be in consumer products that we use all the time, certain kinds of dental floss, and non-stick and stain-resistant textiles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to avoid exposures as we go, so we don't get too depressed about how common these chemicals are. When you see these chemicals, the endocrine disrupting chemicals, some of them will be listed on product labels. So you can avoid parabens and the oxybenzone, benzophenone 3, these UV filters, by looking at labels and buying products that don't contain them. For the sunscreens, you do, of course, want to protect your skin with hats and sun protective clothing and mineral sunscreens. So chemicals that are breast carcinogens, these are chemicals that cause mammary gland tumors in animal studies, include benzene, which is in gasoline, chemicals in auto exhaust and air pollution, paint removers and solvents, some flame retardants, some pesticides, and some water disinfection byproducts. So one kind of hopeful thing to see here is that all the work we're doing to suppress climate change is also going to reduce exposures to breast carcinogens from gasoline and air pollution. So while we're suppressing climate change, we're also creating a healthier future and reducing exposures to breast carcinogens. I'm just going to tell you about 2 epidemiological studies that I think are really important. I don't want to wonk out on you too much this morning, but this study is really an incredible resource for us to understand environmental chemicals in breast cancer. You know, given that chemicals affect the breast across the life cycle, it's really hard to study them in humans because we don't know what we were exposed to 50 years ago in drinking water or air pollution or in our consumer products. But this study gives us an amazing insight into that trajectory. So DDT is a pesticide that was used very widely after World War II until it was banned in 1972 because of its effects on wildlife. And a visionary scientist in Oakland, California, began recruiting women in the 50s and 60s who were giving birth at the Kaiser Hospital and collected blood samples from them a couple days after they had given birth. And these women and their children, and now their grandchildren, have been enrolled in the Child Health and Development Study ever since and followed. So we have this amazing resource to understand their chemical exposures from their blood samples that were collected at the time of these births. And now that as the moms reach their 40s and 50s, and now their daughters are reaching these ages where they can be diagnosed with breast cancer. And we see, just like with DES, higher breast cancer risk in both the moms and the daughters who had the highest exposure levels during these early years when DDT was in use. In fact, among the moms who were the right age to have been exposed to the highest levels of DDT before they were 14 years old, so like just around puberty, they have 5 times higher breast cancer risk by the age of 50. This is an important cautionary tale for us to be careful about all these chemicals we're putting into use without testing them first, and to pay attention to those signals about chemicals that may affect breast cancer risk. The second epidemiological study I want to tell you about is from the Long Island Breast Cancer Study, where they measured PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are products of combustion. So they're in air pollution, tobacco smoke, grilled and smoked food, and other kinds of sources of when something got burned or cooked at a high temperature. And they found that women who had the highest PAH markers in their blood and had genes for poor DNA repair had higher breast cancer risk. So these are women who were exposed to a carcinogen, or PAHs actually have both carcinogenic and endocrine disrupting properties. And when women were exposed to these and their bodies were unable to repair that damage, then they had higher breast cancer risk. So this is a message about this interaction between genes and environment. We see in precision medicine now a great deal of emphasis on genes, but to really be effective, we're going to have to balance that equation with a better understanding of the environment side of the equation. So turning now to how to avoid some of these chemicals that are suspect because they're associated with biological activity linked to breast cancer. I hope you'll try out Silent Spring's smartphone app, Detox Me. It was created to share our knowledge with the wider public, and it includes 270 evidence-based tips to reduce harmful chemicals. You can download it on the App Store or Google Play, and you can check off safer practices you're already doing and commit to adding 1 or 2 a week or 1 or 2 a month, whatever works for you. Track your progress and get badges. It's a lot of fun. It was featured in the HBO movie Not So Pretty this summer. So we got 100,000 new users, and I hope you'll be in the next batch. If you prefer to use the top 10 tips list rather than going through them one at a time, you can get top 10 tips in different categories. I think all of us at Silent Spring have different favorite top 10 tips. I would say some of my top tips are go fragrance free. That's a very easy way to reduce your exposures to estrogenic chemicals. Keep dust levels low. Use a damp cloth to wipe up dust, or vacuum with a HEPA filter, a high efficiency filter. Now in the COVID era, everyone knows what that is. Wash things with plain soap and water, and avoid some of these complicated products. Another resource I love is Clearia. Clearia is a Chrome extension and also a smartphone app, and it's great for online shopping. The Chrome extension is great for online shopping. It uses the Silent Spring Institute breast cancer list of breast cancer relevant chemicals and matches it to the ingredient lists on products and alerts you to products that you may wish to avoid. It's limited, of course, because in the US, you don't have to list all the ingredients and products, but it takes you as far as you can go with products that are listed on the label. And that does help. Silent Spring Institute has two really important areas of research. One is to identify those chemicals that are affecting biological pathways to breast cancer, but the other is to study exposures and how to reduce those exposures. And we conducted a crowdsourced biomonitoring study called Detox Me Action Kit. It's possible some of you were in that study a few years ago. We asked women about their product use and collected urine samples. And what you see here is the results for parabens. Everybody in the study had parabens in them. So these are very common chemicals, and there are many sources, some of which are hard to identify. What you see in the gray dots are women who didn't use any makeup, and they have the lowest paraben levels. But what you see in the purple is women who used makeup, but read the label and avoided parabens. Their paraben levels are very similar to the people who didn't use makeup at all, while those orange dots are women who used makeup and didn't look at the label to avoid parabens. They have the highest levels, including some that are quite high. Another favorite study of mine, we recruited 5 families of 4 in the San Francisco Bay Area and offered them a fresh food diet for 7 days. And we found that they were able to reduce their levels of BPA, an estrogenic chemical, and DEHP, a phthalate, which is anti-androgenic, by more than half in just 3 days. So this is an indication that those chemicals in food packaging and processing are getting into the food we eat. This study, among others, inspired some state-level restrictions on chemicals in food packaging. So things have improved, but we still have a long way to go. I'm especially proud of our work on flame retardants. We first measured flame retardants on Cape Cod in the early 2000s and found levels there 10 times higher than in Europe, where these chemicals had been phased out for health reasons. Then we measured them in California, where we found extremely high levels because of a particular state flammability standard. After this study was published, the governor revised the flammability standard. And because California is such a big market in driving the country, once that flammability standard was changed, you could suddenly buy couches without flame retardants here in Boston, as well as across the country. And good news about that is that those flame retardants were not actually providing safety against lethal fires. So it was a win all around, and firefighters were among the strongest supporters of this change in the flammability rules. We've found since then that now that couches have been switched out, for example, in colleges, there are lower levels of these toxic chemicals in college dorms. So this is an example that shows that when you think about actions you can take to reduce exposures, you need to be thinking not just about your own purchases, but about what's going on in the broader world, since we can't control the furniture at work or at the hospital or in college dorms by ourselves. So think about actions all across the spectrum, from things that you buy yourself to your role perhaps in your workplace as a leader, influences on manufacturers and what they put into products, and regulatory standards that keep us all safe. So in your action tips include voting in every election, because these chemicals are controlled from the local to the national level. And I hope you'll tell your family, friends, coworkers, and neighbors something that you learned about breast cancer and environmental chemicals. Spread the word, and would love it if you keep in touch with Silent Spring. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website or follow us on social media. I just asked you to talk to other people about what you've learned. So I want to provide a couple of tips about how to talk to people who give you some pushback. So for example, especially in October, you're apt to hear messages like there's no proof that XYZ causes breast cancer, or there's no evidence. These messages can be well-intentioned because no one wants to worry. But they also can be paralyzing and keep us from taking the actions we need to protect ourselves. Several major expert panels have made statements about this. For example, the President's Cancer Panel a few years ago said, we need an environmental health paradigm for long latency diseases to enable regulatory action based on compelling animal and in vitro evidence before cause and effect in humans has been proven. So what they're saying is we want to act on the evidence that we have now and not wait for proof. So much of the evidence comes from animal studies and cell studies in cells. So we're trying to think about messages that will help people understand why we use this information. And so see what you think about this, and then I'll pause for questions. We learning about chemical safety from studies in animals and cells is important because we wouldn't do experiments on people to see if chemicals are harmful. In the US, we already use experiments in animals and cells to test whether medicines are safe before we give them to people. This kind of safety testing isn't required before chemicals are used in everyday products, but many scientists think they should be. And I know we got off to a slightly late start, and I want to be sure that we have time for questions, so I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brody. I don't see any questions in the chat, so if you had a couple more slides, you feel free to go ahead.
Okay, I would love to. So, you know, the National Cancer Institute, you would think would be a reliable source, but they're behind on environmental chemicals and cancer. So if you go there, this is related to what kind of evidence we're going to use about breast cancer. You'll see on their website, even if a chemical is shown in a laboratory test to cause cancer, this does not necessarily mean it will cause cancer in people. That's true. But the next sentence should be, often chemicals that cause cancer in lab tests do also cause cancer in people. And because of that, US EPA and the Food and Drug Administration use this information to make decisions to keep us safe. Another thing you might hear is that individual chemicals are likely to cause only a small increase in risk. This could be true sometimes and false sometimes, but in any case, we're exposed to many chemicals every day, and the risks can add up. Besides, small risks can add up to many people in the US getting sick. For those who want to dig in further on the science, we co-sponsored, co-organized with Dana-Farber last year a forum series, and the recordings are all on our website, and they're a great resource for if you want to refer skeptics or if you want to dig in on the science yourself. Here's a hopeful study that showed that breast cancer incidence can go down when we change what we're doing. In 2002, when the Women's Health Initiative was published, many women went off that combination estrogen, progesterone, hormone replacement therapy, and breast cancer incidence actually went down. Researchers estimated that resulted in 22,000 fewer breast cancer cases per year when older women went off the combination HRT. So that makes me think about what we might see if we took seriously reducing the many exposures to breast cancer relevant chemicals, including chemicals that act like hormones. I hope you did learn a few things that you will find useful to create a healthier future for yourself, your family, and your community. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Brody. So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. And so since this is such since this is a new topic for us, people have certainly learned from your discussion, and they're looking forward to downloading the apps that you mentioned. And yes, just to remind everyone, these talks will be available on our website. So one question that we have is, what about the chemicals in mosquito sprays?
Well, there are many different kinds of mosquito sprays. There are some that I use. DEET is not too bad, and there are some eucalyptus-based, plant-based sprays. Picaridin is another one. Those three I would consider safe. We have been learning more about the non-active ingredients in the wide area pesticide sprays. They can include PFAS. It would be much preferable to reformulate these pesticides and not include those chemicals. We don't want to spray PFAS all over our communities because of concerns about mosquito.
Wonderful. Thank you. And maybe I'll just ask one more, because I know this is a hot topic for many people. What about hair color, dyeing our hair?
Hair color is a suspect. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences sister study, which is one of the biggest breast cancer studies to take on environmental questions, has been studying hair dye and reported several results related to hair dye, and particularly increased risk among Black women who have used hair dye. The darker hair dyes are more likely to contain carcinogens. This is a area of active research. It's hard to study for obvious reasons, because people are changing the products they use, the products are changing formulation. But based on the results of the NIH sister study, I would be cautious about hair dye.
Thank you. An important note for all of us. And again, highlighting some disparities, as you said, if women,
Yes.
if Black women are at higher risk. So
yes, that I also want to mention that Silent Spring Institute right now is partnering with Black and Latina women in LA to specifically look at what kinds of hair products they're using. And we've found that we know that Black women have higher levels of some of these endocrine disruptors in their urine. And we've tested hair products and found them there. So we're trying to work on that specifically.